Thank you very much. It's a privilege for me to introduce Professor Cesari. I know her from her works on religion in relation to the politics. My name is Mustafa. I am a non-residential research fellow at European Center for Populism Studies. In my PhD, I studied impact of democratization and authoritization on foreign policy decision-making. And recently, I am more drawn into the role of religion in decision-making process, especially again in relation to foreign policy and especially diffusion of authoritarian regimes and role of religion. I am interested. Recently, I have published an article, Role of Religion in Populism in relation to populism, and the guest editor was Professor Cesari. It was an honor for me. And yeah, in 1990s, when we look at the discussion, role of religion, and the discussion was that religion will be an irrelevant phenomenon in the next century. But now what we observe the other way. In contrast, now we are talking about role of religion in decision-making processes. Similarly, we also revisit the concept of populism in the 21st century because it is on the rise again. And bringing together this role of politics and religion, I think Professor Cesari was the brightest and the leading name in this field. So you are welcome, Professor Cesari. And I highly recommend that check on her academia page. You'll see lots of relevant, very good articles. And also on her university page, you'll see her research portal. And there are lots of good articles there. I highly recommend. Professor Cesari, floor is yours.
Thank you.
Happy to have you.
Thank you very much, Mustafa, for this kind introduction. And hello, everybody. And I'm very happy to be with you. And I hope it's not going to be just me lecturing, but I would like very much to get a lot of feedback from you. So without further ado, I am going to share my screen. Can you see the slides?
Yes,
okay.
we can see. Yeah.
So once we bring together these two terms, populism and religion, we are opening a can of worms or Pandora box, because nobody agrees on what is populism. And there is no consensus on defining religion either. And for me, this is not really an issue, and you will understand why. So let's start with populism. For the sake of this research on religion and populism, I decided to highlight two features that come across multiple definitions. And that's the one that I have investigated through different case studies. The first one is the definition of the people. We all agree that populism involves an identification to a unified and sometimes idealized collective people. When we say we, and the we in populism is usually understood as we against another group, either class or religion or culture or language. So that's the first dimension. How do we say we, the people? And the second dimension is anti-elite. So I would say that this is a real distinctive feature of populism, and probably already you have heard this since you have started this, this program. You are populist when you define the people, not only horizontally against another people, but also vertically. When you say we the people, we are against the elite, the establishment, the traditional political, but also cultural elite. It's not just only the elected bodies, it's also who talks in the media, who defines the cultural parameters. This is also part of the populist identity or definition. So in other words, populism here has to combine both anti-elite and anti-pluralist definition of the people, because a lot of scholars have shown that you can identify two people without making it something that is a unified entity against others. So that's the starting point on how I will try to unfold with you when and how religion matters. The second element is that also people do not agree on how to investigate populism. Some would say it's an ideology. Others would say it's a strategy or discourse. And my position here with lots of other scholars is to stay away from a stark dichotomy between populist versus non-populist, because if you consider that this opposition is very stark, you do not see the nuances and the way that different ideological group, different type of leadership or strategy are actually using populism or borrowings to terms and topics that are actually populist. So in this respect, I define populism as a political style, not as an ideology and not as a discourse only. So what is a political style? That's the most recent approach to populism that I found very relevant to look at religion. So political style is a repertoire of embodied, symbolically mediated performance toward audience. And it means that it's not looking at the discourse, it's also looking at the staging. You know, how do leaders stage? What are the people? What is the vision of the elite? And also it includes action. The problem I have with most of the populist studies is that they look only at the discourse. But populism is not only a discourse, it does involve action, concrete action, policy making. And we tend not to look at that. In other words, the political style is more concrete. It's not just looking at, you know, content analysis of some terms. It's also looking at how does the leader present himself? How does it connect with the citizens or the political entities? What does it involve concretely for the life of people under populist kind of ruling or populist leadership? So once you look at populism as a political style, involving a certain definition of the elite and a certain identification to people, you can engage in a cross-country and cross-religious comparison, because you are not limited by the ideology or the religion of each case. So that's why in this presentation, I'm going to show you the work I just did comparing Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin and Erdogan. And so why can I do that? Because I'm not limited by, I don't know, the ideology of each party, of each leader. I'm looking at the way that they present the people and that they act against the establishment using religious, not only terminology, but also actions. And that's, again, something we tend to forget. So to do that, I do not present you a definition of religion, I would say, a priori to start with, because once you do that, you are completely limiting yourself, and actually you are projecting on a particular situation what you think is religion, which may be very different from what the people in the different contexts are experiencing, living, or even dreaming about when they define themselves as religion. So sorry for the misspelling address here. So what I'm calling here religion is not what I decide is religion. It's looking at what are the themes, the group, the institution that either define themselves as religious or are identified as religious, and that are part of this populist style. So it doesn't mean, however, that I take this at face value, but it is an important entry to understand what is contested. What interests me is when there is a contestation, what people do not agree, when they say this is religious and this is not. My job is not to say, oh, they are right or wrong. My job is to say, what is at stake here? Why is there some kind of tension here about what is religious, who is religious, and what is right or wrong when it comes to religion? And interestingly, when we look at religious populism, you will see that the so-called secular political actors are very, very much engaged in defining what is religion. So if I just look at religion from my a priori definition that this is about belief and spirituality, I'm not going to get what is really at stake in the religious dimension of populism. And so it means another element is that what I'm saying is I cannot look at religion as belief, because it won't tell me a lot about populism. And I cannot look at religion as text or doctrines. Actually, this is a dead end. If you do that, you're not getting what's the religious dimension of populism. But I will look at what are the political acts motivated by religion. And when I say political acts, it means laws, it means procedures, it means mobilization that are done in the name of religion. So in other words, what I'm looking at is who is involved. And I'm not limiting myself to say, oh, I'm going to look at the clerics only to understand religious populism. I'm just going to look at the discourse of some secular elite on religion. I look at both, because if you look at both, you get what take. And it's the hardest, because it means that you cannot just mobilize political science, because as Mustafa said rightly, I mean, for a long time, the political scientists have neglected religion, and they are still not clear on what they have to look at when you look at religion. So my method is more coming from the religious studies and history, where they are less I would say, intimidated by religion, but their problem is the opposite. They think that everything is religion, which I don't think is the case either. And most of the time, the people from religious studies are looking at religion from a very Western or Christian approach, which is belief. What I see in religious populism, it's not about the belief. It's about how do I regulate the behavior, the identities, and the control on people based on religion. It's very little to do with the belief or the theological, reflection as such. So another interesting point, if you look at populism this way, is that you open up a new venue, and this was an interesting part of the work I did. But you see that religion is very efficient to broaden up populism beyond the nation. There is a lot of debate. I'm not going to overload you with that, but most of the time people take for granted that populism is national. Yes, it is, but there are also possibilities to have a sort of transnational form of populism, and religion is a very relevant tool to do that, because most of religions mobilize the people outside the boundaries of the nation. And so what I'm saying is you do not need to be transnational to do religious populism, but in some cases, religious populism benefit and are even strengthened by the transnational mobilization of the religious people. And this was striking, especially when I compared Putin and Erdogan. Much less about Trump, but I will explain why a little later. So having set the stage, so to speak, I will show you that there are several aspects of what I call the religious dimension of populism. So if I look at elites, if I take the vertical axis, what's the role of religion on this particular axis? The role of religion is dual. It is about defining the opposition to the political elite on religious ground, not only on class ground. I'm not saying that class is not important, but the religious populace by I would say strategy, goal, or intention is mobilizing an anti-elite on religious ground. And second, and that's the less studied of all, it is also enacting politics on religious ground. So let me show what I mean exactly. So anti-elitism motivated by religion. Take Trump, for example. So Trump, since the beginning of his mandate, mobilized the definition of the elite based on religion. It means that he uses religious terms in his political speech. It means also that he presents himself as the defender of some religious values against the corrupted, liberal, secular, immoral political establishment. And this political establishment doesn't include only the elected bodies, but also the elite and the media elite and the cultural elite or intellectual elite. And the opposition is always we, the moral people, cannot accept anymore the ruling done by a very small number of group or elite that are not following the rule of law, that are not moral, that are not recognizing the role of God in the destiny of America. So I can multiply the example. I did a sort of survey by looking from 2010 to now to the not only the discourse again, but what were the policies involved with this religious populism. And I took this period because that was the one where Putin, Trump, and Erdogan were all in power at the time. So this is for, I think this is his inauguration in January 2017. And you can see that there were all religious leaders present. He has also multiplied what I call a public or promotion of his image as a defender of the faith. It's important to understand that this, even if he's not a religious person, interestingly, for most of the religious leaders who follow him or supported him, it's not important. That's a big mistake that people are saying it's just manipulation and it doesn't reflect the reality of people. The people on the ground are very aware that Trump has never been a religious or moral man, but it doesn't matter because they are not looking at his personal profile. They are looking at the values or the concrete action he can enact in the name of religion. So they are seeing him as a tool. It's a very religious vision about what can he do for us, even if he's just a vehicle, and it doesn't matter that he's not pious. Again, because religion here is not seen at the personal level. It is seen as a marker or feature of the collectivity that I, as a citizen and a believer, want to defend. And people are very clear against that, about that. That's why the secular political scientists that talk about alienation are mistaken, or instrumentalization. People know that Trump is no good, but it doesn't matter. It does things that is good for their vision of the political community in the name of religion. Yeah, if I move to Erdogan, Erdogan is interesting because it's another case where you can see that he is enacting these values. I'm not saying that he's a paragon of virtue, but he's putting himself in the way he acts within the Islamic tradition, okay? But he has built his own legitimacy even before populism was fashionable to look into, as the leader of the people, of all the people of Turkey, based on the moral values coming from Islam. Since the end of the 90s, he has promoted the building of what he calls the pious generation, trying to bring back into the perception of the political style of the Turkish elite, the importance of religion. So his whole discourse in the beginning, I would say until 2011 or 12, was to oppose the Kemalist secular establishment to the real people of Turkey, grounded in Islamic values. And this discourse, again, it involves some action. The last one, I think it's from a month ago, there was an inauguration in Taksim Square of a new mosque. Why? This is again putting this on the ground figuratively and symbolically. Why Taksim Square? Because, as you know, this was the site of a huge contestation, not only against the project he had at the time in the place, but against the whole authoritarian turn toward authoritarianism of Erdogan. So building a mosque here, where there used to be also, I don't know if it's still there, a statue of Kemal Atatürk, is really the staging of a new Turkey based on the values of Islam. So again, this is not about economy. This is not about just language. It is about saying we, the people, are defined by religious values. And as such, we are acting against a certain type of elite. Third, the same thing with Putin. And we tend not to see that because we have like this vision of Putin being a post-communist leader. It's very, very interesting to see that Putin, again, is not a paragon of virtue, but it doesn't matter. It's like Trump, you know. He has been working since his beginning as a ruler in conjunction with the reference of Orthodoxy and with the Russian Orthodox Church. And it is always presented in his speeches and action as a way to defend traditional Orthodox morality against anti-Western secular elite. Interestingly, he's not targeting the secular elite within because of the communist past, but he's projecting an immoral secular feature on the Western elite. And this works very well with the Russian population, who have a strong anti-Western sentiment that doesn't date only from now. You can put it back to Second World War, to the condition of the, Cold War. This never completely disappeared. What is interesting is that now it's cloaked into references to Orthodoxy that is presented as the only way to be a good ruler for Russian people. You have to pay allegiance or recognize that Orthodoxy has to be an element of the ruling and political establishment. And he has, of course, a strong support, and I put him here with the Patriarch Kirill, the strong support of the religious institutions. So this is the first element on the vertical axis. The second one on the vertical axis toward elite is religious policy. motivated by religion. So what does it mean? It means that Trump didn't only talk. He really enacted changes in legislation that was showing his commitment to religion. So again, it is saying, I want to change the political establishment by putting it on religious ground. So of course, it's all the question of pro-life, anti-abortion, appointing conservative judges to the Supreme Court to make sure that they will deliver rulings that will conform to this vision of a moral politics. It's also multiple measures to undermine the work done in previous administration to secure the rights or protection under the law of the LGBTQ. So this is concrete things. We are not talking here just about symbolics, you know. And that's the reason why the religious establishment, or part of it, I'm not talking about the whole religious groups in the US, but that's the reason why the evangelical leaders and institutions are supporting Trump. Not because he's pious, but because he's doing exactly that. And that's why looking at the personal feature of religion is misguiding. What is at stake is what does the political leader do that help me in my understanding of my political and religious community? And that's the discriminating factor here, the key critical element. And it comes also much less, actually, I would say, in Erdogan, which is fascinating to me because we see Erdogan as, at least until 2011 and 12, he didn't demolish the secular legislation of the past. The only thing he tried to do at some point was to remove secular from the constitution, but he got a big pushback against that. Homosexuality has been decriminalized since 1858 because it's part of 1858. Sorry, because it's part of the past. This was decriminalized under the declining Ottoman Empire, and it is in the Turkish legislation, and he has not removed it. But he is trying to push a vision that is indeed a moral vision. There is no protection against discrimination based on gender and sexuality. But guess what? There was none either before under the secular or Kemalist. That's why we have to be clear here. What he's promoting is also a more conservative or moral vision of women. There was some attempt of going back on the laws, allowing abortion and so on, but the women mobilized so much, including women within the AKP, that he didn't change that. But for example, his more recent action was to withdraw from the Istanbul Convention, which actually, despite the name, is not Turkey. It is a convention to protect women's rights everywhere. So he was, before that, this convention was promoted and endorsed by Turkey. He has withdrawn Turkey from that. Not so much because of the question of women's rights, actually, but because of the defense of a moral religious community that doesn't allow homosexuality. What was the point here was a vision of the Turkish family that doesn't favor same-sex marriages or recognition of marriage that is not between a man and a woman. Another example of religious policy, it's same thing in Russia. Putin has been very active in implementing in the law a protection of religious belief. There is a 2013 law called the blasphemy law. I mean, with some kind of stretch, but it meant that you have to protect the feelings of believers by criminalizing actions that disrespect society or offend believers. This was really pushed forward by the Russian Orthodox Church, and he gave in. It came after the incident. I don't know if you know this group called Pussy Riots. They did a sort of demonstration in front of a church, and they are pretty much naked, and this was seen as a big offense. One or two of the women went to jail, and based on this pushback, supported by the Russian Orthodox Church, this new law came in. And there are tons of examples where people can end up being fined or sentenced because they are seen as insulting the religious belief of or the values of orthodoxy. Interestingly, in 2020, there was an amendment of the Russian constitution, and along the same line, the new constitution recognized marriage only between a man and a woman, and also considered that orthodoxy is part of the essential inherent identity of Russia. That's what I call religious policy. On the horizontal axis now, of course, all of them multiply identification to we the people as national people. For example, for Trump, it's clear that the Christian and American aspect are the same. He has, unlike the two others, Erdogan and Putin, he has less religiously motivated foreign policy. There are two examples. The first one is the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. But you cannot say that he has been initiating the non-conditional support to Israel. This is a feature, a continuous feature of US administration. What he did is to give it a more religious tone, more apocalyptical tone. Because as he said, it was not because of the Jewish influence, actually, unlike what people think. It's because he wanted to please the evangelical. So this was a concession to the evangelical, but otherwise you cannot say that he had more than ever or more than previous administrations supported Israel. This is not confirmed in the facts. Actually, the Obama administration, though cloaked in secular rhetoric, has been, unlike what people think, even against what some Israelis think, has been the most materially supporting administration to Israel. So, and the second element is also the promotion of religious freedom internationally. Again, this is not a Trump innovation. That's why I've not put him here on more so significant on the transnational line. This, the promotion of religious freedom internationally was started under Clinton. And he has, again, what Trump tried to do is to promote a more, I would say, set of values that are not secular approach to international right, what he called traditional values, in a terminology and approach very similar to Putin, saying we want to defend traditional value, meaning he wants to defend the right to against to be against homosexuality or against abortion internationally. But again, you cannot say that this is a continuous push toward during his work. More of his tenure was really about promoting an American-based religious community more than exporting it internationally, and that's shown also in his following. I mean, they are concerned mostly with the white American Christian community and much less with the global aspect. The global aspect of the religious engagement come from other religious groups that are not automatically, even if they are evangelical, that are not automatically supporting Trump, as much as the one who want to promote a white Christian America. But that's different for Erdogan and for Putin. So, of course, Erdogan has been very adamant to promote himself as the leader of the Ummah, as a transnational people. Okay, so he is calling all the time Ittihad Islam, the unity of Islam, and he wants to be recognized as a major leader of the global Muslim community. And then a component of that is, of course, Ottomanism and the return to the history, not to the Ottoman Caliphate state, but to the history and the reference of Ottomanism, which is a big change with the Kemalist period, where there was not even Ottoman history, where the Kemalist narrative was, we are a new people, we are not defined anymore by the past caliphate. This is a big change. And it shows in a lot of international position. But the most symbolic, again, the staging of it was the conversion of Hagia Sophia in a mosque, the continuous position of Erdogan, especially in Europe, against Islamophobia. It's absolutely fascinating how he presents himself as a Muslim leader that has a moral responsibility to defend Muslims and anti-Muslim sentiment everywhere. And also there is obviously his position in favor of the Palestinian in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But again, this third aspect is not specific to Erdogan. This is the easiest element that all leaders, including the secular one in the Muslim world, have mobilized to gain popularity. What is specific is this positioning as the leader of the global Muslim community, and it does pay domestically. I mean, it's a way to maintain the popularity of the regime and also to gain I would say regional leverage. You can see it also in his regional politics in the Syrian conflict, in his attempt to appear as central, not only in Syria, but also in Libya, and to bring this defense of Islam as a tool or asset for becoming a regional leader. I don't think he has the ambition or the dream to govern all Islam, but it's clear that it is a way also to posit himself, or Turkey rather, as a central power in the stability or equilibrium of the Middle East region. And I would say he has pretty much succeeded in that. I have already taken too much time, but let me finish. The same thing for Putin. Here, the key concept is not Ummah, it's called Holy Rus. And it's a transnational community with Moscow as the third Rome. After Rome and Byzantine, Moscow is now the third Rome. And it means that you promote a shared Orthodox religion everywhere. So it shows in multiple initiatives, but for example, in the war in Donbass or the annexation of Crimea, it was possible because the priests of the Russian Orthodox Church were sent on the territory of Donbass or Crimea to discuss with the military there, the opponents, and the military had more trust in the Orthodox Church or clerics than they had in the army of Putin. That's the concrete thing here. So you see that's very parallel to the Ummah. Besides this kind of regional influence, there is in the strategy of the Russian Orthodox Church the goal to promote what they call a new civilizational order based on traditional values. This is more based in the church than in the Putin administration itself, but it does also help Putin internationally. And the Russian Orthodox Church, in a way that is very similar to some global Islamic movement. I'm not talking about Erdogan here, but global Islamic movement like the Muslim Brothers or others, or even radical ones. This is the idea of we want to promote an alternative civilizational project, alternative to the corrupted Western model. And interestingly, the more negative terms I have found and this towards the West were not in the Islamist discourse, they were in the Orthodox Church, or the promoter of this international order that has to be against the West, which means Europe, Christian, Catholic specifically. And that is also associated with liberal, secular, and immoral. So to conclude, you see what the interest of the political style here is to allow an approach to religious populism that do not limit it to religious nationalism. Religious nationalism is not religious populism. Religious nationalism are people who define themselves as members of a national community based on their religious identity. Of a national community, yes, based on their religious identity. But it doesn't mean, so that's the horizontal act, but it doesn't mean that they want to have a religiously based system of government or elite. That's the difference here. And that's what the survey show in the US. We have tons of Americans, even if they are not followers of Trump, that consider America as Christian. It doesn't mean that they want to mobilize and have leaders who implement religious policies. Actually, they would be even appalled by that. And the survey shows that they are appalled by that. Actually, the more religious the people are in their life, the less attracted they are to this kind of religious populism. And the second element is that religious populism is not nativism. Nativism is more what define what we call today the religious populist in Western Europe, is the ones that say we are Christian. So religious nativism is about defining the nation based on religion against Islam or the others, but they do not implement religious policies. They don't even want it. They are very secular. So what usually people consider religious populists in Europe are more kind of nativist populists or nativist movement, meaning they say, we Christian cannot accept a Muslim component of our national identity and we're going to fight against it. That's nativism. I have not seen any right-wing group defining itself as Christian, either in Germany or in France or in the Netherlands, try to enact secular law, to enact at the political establishment level secular law, religious laws. Actually, you see a lot of women with a feminist agenda into this movement because it is not about changing the political order. It's more against them, the Muslims. So you see why here, looking at the two dimensions help us identify what is really religious populism. Also, what is important here to take away is that I never looked at religion as a belief of people, because it doesn't tell me anything about religious populism, honestly. As I just said, the one that are the citizens that are the more interested in this kind of enactment are not automatically the more religious one. And they are not supporting the pious leaders. They are supporting the leaders that they see in helping them promote a certain agenda or vision of their community. And so this is interesting. Then you can look at the attacks on the Capitol in January of this year. This is, again, within the religious populists, lots of them would approve, a change in political regime and change the law toward more religious legislation, but it doesn't mean that all of them are anti-system. What we saw in the January 6th attack is a group within the religious populists that are anti-system, that want to destroy the system. And we don't have enough data or survey to understand who and how. There is an ongoing work done here in the US about, the authoritarian profile. It's not only being in favor of religious populism, it is also a type of people who show what we call authoritarian psychology, and it goes also with anti-women, very authoritarian, attraction towards a strong leader against democratic rules. Again, you cannot say that the whole people who voted for Trump are representing this tiny group that mobilized the attacks on January 6th. But that's the smaller circle within what I call this religious populist. And the final element, which I think is very interesting and not sufficiently studied comparatively, is the influence, the fact that a religion can also give you resources for transnational influence or foreign policy action. And I will stop here and thank you for your attention. Thank you.